The 1%, Part 7. Berkeley as Philosophical Origin. MXDM, aka Pirate 1, VJ, Tsunami X. April 10th, 2026. Part 7. The Replication Template. 31. Berkeley as Philosophical Origin. Every replicable model requires an origin that is more than a first instance. The first instance provides the proof that the model works, the demonstration, in specific conditions, with specific people, through the specific challenges that the first attempt always generates, that the model is capable of producing what it claims to produce. The first instance is necessary. Without it, the model is a proposal rather than a template, a theory rather than a practice, an aspiration rather than a demonstration. The first instance converts the model from the subjunctive, what might be produced if the conditions were right, to the indicative, what has been produced in the conditions that the first instance found or created. But the first instance is not sufficient to make the model genuinely replicable. A model that is replicable only in the specific conditions of its first instance, that requires the exact combination of personalities and resources and historical circumstances and geographical context that the first instance happened to possess, is not a template. It is a singular achievement, admirable, instructive, but not the foundation of the network that the 1% doctrine proposes. The origin that makes the model genuinely replicable is not primarily the first instance. It is the philosophical origin, the conceptual foundation, the organizing principle, the governing logic that preceded the first instance and will survive every subsequent instance, that is independent of the specific conditions of any specific implementation, and that provides the intellectual authority from which the network's coherence derives. Berkeley is the philosophical origin of the 1% doctrine in this specific and precise sense. Not because Berkeley was the site of the first successful implementation. It was not. Not because Berkeley validated the model through institutional endorsement. It did not. But because Berkeley was the site of the encounter that made the doctrine's governing logic legible in the sharpest possible relief. The encounter between the aspiration for permanent meaning territory and the scarcity era system's specific form of resistance to it. The encounter that revealed, through the specific character of the resistance, the exact nature of what the doctrine is proposing to change. The philosophical origin is distinguished from the first instance by its relationship to resistance. The first instance demonstrates that the model works in favorable conditions, conditions that have been identified, created, or discovered to be sufficiently aligned with the model's requirements to allow it to produce its claimed outputs. The philosophical origin demonstrates that the model is real enough to be resisted in unfavorable conditions, that the system whose transformation the model proposes recognized the model as a genuine challenge and responded to it as such. What was resisted in Berkeley was not a sculpture proposal. What was resisted, through the specific form of the 5-year limit and the parking fallback and the city planning board's reasonable-sounding invocation of reversibility, was the foundational claim of the 1% doctrine, that a portion of the scarcity era's spatial and economic resources should be permanently allocated to the non-economic organization of human meaning. The resistance was precise. It did not contest the allocation itself. The city's planning infrastructure acknowledged the legitimacy of the art allocation, endorsed the principle of the 1% rule, accepted the proposition that some fraction of the development's resources should go to something other than economic function. The resistance was specifically to the permanence, to the claim that the allocation was not a temporary gesture toward the cultural, but a permanent commitment to a different organizing principle for a piece of the city's spatial infrastructure. Permanence was the specific threat, because permanence was the specific thing that separated the decorative from the civilizational, the 1% that performs cultural sensitivity from the 1% that actually begins to reorganize the relationship between economic and non-economic space in the built environment. The temporary artwork knows its place. The permanent territory claims one, and the claiming of a place. The assertion that this specific piece of the city's spatial infrastructure is organized permanently around a different principle than the economic function that organizes the rest of it, is the claim that the scarcity-era planning system was designed to prevent. Berkeley prevented it, and in preventing it, made it legible. The doctrine's claim about the relationship between economic and non-economic space. The claim that the 1% should be permanently allocated to the transition infrastructure of the post-scarcity civilization rather than temporarily allocated to the decorative gesture that the scarcity-era planning system was designed to receive, would have been, without the Berkeley encounter, an abstract proposition. A theoretical argument for a different spatial organization of the built environment, supported by the philosophical framework of the post-scarcity transition and the conceptual architecture of the Dreamcatcher governance model and the spatial logic of the transition campus. After the Berkeley encounter is not only a theoretical argument. It is the argument that the system recognized as threatening enough to resist. And an argument that a system recognizes as threatening is an argument that the system understands at whatever level of self-awareness institutional systems are capable of, poses a genuine challenge to its organizing principle. This recognition, the system's recognition of the doctrine as a genuine challenge, is what the philosophical origin provides that the first successful instance cannot. The first successful instance proves that the model works in favorable conditions. The philosophical origin proves that the model is threatening to the unfavorable conditions that it is designed to transform. Both proofs are necessary for the replication template's full authority. The first instance demonstrates viability. The philosophical origin demonstrates necessity. The necessity of the transformation the model proposes, legible in the specific character of the resistance the transformation encountered. Berkeley is the philosophical origin of the 1% doctrine because it is the site where the doctrine's necessity was demonstrated through the encounter with the system's resistance. The replication template derives its authority from this origin in three specific ways. The first is the authority of the clearly defined problem. Every replication template requires a clearly defined problem, the specific failure of the existing system that the template is designed to address. Without a clearly defined problem, the template is a solution in search of a need, a model looking for the conditions that would justify its deployment. The template that emerges from a philosophical origin has its problem definition provided by the origin itself, by the specific character of the encounter that made the problem legible. Berkeley's specific form of resistance, the 5-year limit, the parking fallback, the explicit preference for the reversible over the permanent, the planning system's inability to receive the proposition that a piece of the city's spatial infrastructure might be organized around meaning rather than economic function, defines the problem with a precision that no abstract theoretical characterization could produce. The problem is not the scarcity-era planning system fails to allocate sufficient resources to culture. That problem is widely acknowledged and has generated 100 policy responses, from arts endowments to cultural districts to percent for art regulations, none of which has addressed the underlying problem that the Berkeley encounter makes precise. The precise problem is the scarcity-era planning system is structurally incapable of receiving the permanent allocation of spatial resources to non-economic organizing principles, because its entire architecture, its definitions of appropriate land use, its metrics of successful development, its instruments of review and approval and time limiting, is organized around the assumption that the economic function is primary and the non-economic is residual, tolerated in proportion to its willingness to accept its residuality and resisted when it begins to claim the permanence that would make it something other than residual. This precise problem definition is what the Berkeley encounter provides, and the replication template that addresses this precise problem. The template that proposes to embed the permanent allocation of spatial resources to non-economic organizing principles in the economic infrastructure itself, through the 1% mechanism deployed in private development where the planning system's resistance cannot reach, is the template that is precisely calibrated to the precisely defined problem. The replication template's authority as a solution is inseparable from the precision of the problem that the philosophical origin defines. Every subsequent campus in the 1% network will encounter versions of the Berkeley problem. The institutional resistance to the permanent allocation of spatial resources to non-economic organizing principles, in the specific forms that the specific institutional landscape of each campus's location generates. The Berkeley origin provides the conceptual vocabulary for recognizing these versions of the problem as instances of the same problem that Berkeley made precise, and the philosophical framework for understanding why the 1% template addresses the problem at the level of its structural cause rather than its specific institutional manifestation. The second is the authority of the demonstrated alternative. The philosophical origin does not only define the problem. It demonstrates that the problem has an alternative, that the scarcity-era planning system's resistance to the permanent allocation of spatial resources to non-economic organizing principles is not the only possible response to the aspiration for permanent meaning territory, because there exist institutional contexts in which the resistance does not apply. The alternative demonstrated by the Berkeley encounter is not immediately obvious. It required the specific leap of the 1% doctrine's central insight to make it legible. The insight that the private development context, specifically the luxury development context of the high-value real estate that the 1% rule was designed for, is the institutional context in which the planning system's resistance does not apply to the permanent allocation of spatial resources to non-economic organizing principles. The luxury developer who decides to embed a permanent transition campus in her development's master plan is not asking the city planning board for permission to make the allocation permanent. She is making it permanent through the design decision that organizes her development's spatial infrastructure around the transition campus as its identifying center. The planning system's review is of the development's compliance with existing regulations, not of the permanence of the specific allocation within the development's own spatial organization. The permanence is not reviewable by the system that resisted it in Berkeley, because the system that resisted it in Berkeley is not the system that governs the luxury developer's allocation of her development's own resources. This demonstration of the alternative, the specific institutional pathway through which the Berkeley problem solution can be implemented without requiring the resolution of the Berkeley problem in the institutional context where the resistance cannot be dissolved, is what makes the 1% doctrine a template rather than a critique. The critique of the scarcity-era planning system's resistance to permanent non-economic allocation is not new and not sufficient. The critique has been made, in various forms, by every urban theorist who has observed the relationship between the planning system's stated commitment to cultural provision and its actual practice of limiting that provision to the temporary, the decorative, and the reversible. What the Berkeley encounter adds to the critique is the specific alternative, the specific institutional pathway that the 1% template provides, that converts the critique from the observation of a problem into the demonstration of its solution. The replication template's authority as an alternative derives from the Berkeley origin's specific demonstration that the alternative is not merely theoretical. The Berkeley rejection was not a rejection of the alternative. It was a rejection of the aspiration within the institutional context of the public planning system. The alternative exists in the adjacent institutional context of the private development system. The Berkeley encounter made the existence of the alternative legible by making the specific institutional boundary between the context where the resistance applies and the context where it does not precisely visible. Every subsequent campus in the 1% network will navigate a version of this institutional boundary, will encounter the resistance in some institutional contexts and the alternative in others, will require the specific judgment about where the boundary runs in the specific institutional landscape of the specific location to deploy the template in the context where the alternative is available rather than the context where the resistance will prevent it. The Berkeley origin provides the philosophical foundation for that judgment, the conceptual framework within which the institutional boundary can be recognized and navigated, derived from the specific encounter where the boundary was first made precisely visible. The third is the authority of a moral claim. Every replication template requires a moral claim. The answer to the question of why the transformation the template proposes is not merely technically superior to the existing arrangements, but genuinely necessary in the moral sense that makes the effort of replication worth undertaking. The technical superiority of the 1% template over the scarcity-era planning system's approach to cultural provision is real and documentable. The permanent transition campus generates more enduring social value than the temporary sculpture in the plaza. The dream validation process produces more genuine collective intelligence than the Arts Commission's adjudication of grant applications. The cross-class community of the transition campus produces more genuine cross-different solidarity than the cultural district's offering of bourgeois cultural consumption to the professional class. These are genuine technical superiorities, and they provide genuine reasons for the template's adoption. But they are not the moral claim that makes the effort of replication genuinely necessary rather than merely advisable. The moral claim of the 1% doctrine derives from the specific population that the Berkeley encounter made visible. The planning system that resisted the permanent transition campus in Berkeley, that preferred the parking lot to the post-scarcity prototype, the reversible to the committed, the economic function to the non-economic organizing principle, was not merely making a planning judgment. It was making a moral judgment about whose needs the city's spatial infrastructure should prioritize. The parking lot serves the people who own cars, which in the specific social geography of Berkeley adjacent to the University of California's cognitive elite, is primarily the professional and managerial class whose institutional presence in the city, the university, and its associated industries sustain. The permanent transition campus serves the people who are being displaced by the cognitive equalization, the taxi drivers and the call center workers and the mid-level managers and the junior analysts and the laborers and the service workers and the full range of people whose employment the transition is dissolving and for whom the existing planning system has no infrastructure. The moral claim is therefore this: the scarcity-era planning system's resistance to the permanent transition campus is not merely a technical failure of institutional design. It is a moral failure of institutional priority, the prioritization of the spatial needs of the car-owning professional class over the civilizational needs of the population that the cognitive equalization is displacing. This moral claim is not made against the specific planning board members who enforced the 5-year limit in Berkeley. They were acting in good faith within the institutional mandate and the institutional vocabulary that the scarcity-era planning system provided them. The moral claim is made against the institutional arrangement that gave them no other vocabulary, that made the parking lot the only alternative to the temporary artwork, that organized the planning system's entire architecture around the assumption that the economic function is primary and the non-economic is residual, that provided no institutional category for the permanent allocation of spatial resources to the civilizational need of the population that the transition is displacing. The moral claim is the claim that this institutional arrangement is inadequate to the moment, that the civilizational transition of the cognitive equalization requires an institutional response that the scarcity-era planning system is structurally incapable of providing, and that the inadequacy of the existing institutional arrangement constitutes a genuine moral failure in the specific sense that the people whose need the existing arrangement cannot meet are the people whose need is most urgent. This moral claim is what makes the replication of the 1% template not merely technically advisable, but genuinely necessary. What gives the effort of building the network, of developing the governance architecture, of designing the spatial infrastructure, of funding the economic substrate, the specific moral urgency that makes the effort worth the difficulty it requires. The parking lot that Berkeley chose instead of the transition campus will eventually become a robotaxi depot, the obsolete infrastructure of the automobile civilization repurposed for the autonomous mobility that is already obsoleting it. The transition campus that Berkeley refused will eventually be built in the adjacent institutional context of the private development that the 1% template provides, or in the public institutional context that the political economy of the transition will eventually produce when the scale of the displacement makes the moral failure of the existing institutional arrangement undeniable. In the interval, The interval between the Berkeley rejection and the eventual institutional recognition of the transition campus's necessity. The people who are being displaced by the cognitive equalization have no permanent institutional landing structure. They have the temporary programs of the retraining economy and the income floors of the welfare state's displacement response. They do not have the campus. The moral urgency of the replication template is the moral urgency of that interval. The specific period of time during which the people who most need the landing structure the template provides are living without it, and during which the replication of the template is the only mechanism through which the landing structure can be made available to them faster than the institutional recognition of its necessity would produce it. Berkeley is the philosophical origin of this moral urgency. The 5-year limit and the parking fallback are not merely planning decisions. They are the specific institutional form that the moral failure took in the specific encounter where the failure was made visible. The doctrine does not forget this. Every campus in the network is built in the knowledge that it is being built in the interval, that the people it serves are the people the Berkeley Planning Board decision left without a landing structure. Every governance innovation in the network is developed in the knowledge that it is being developed to serve the people whose need the existing institutional arrangement cannot meet. Every replication of the template is undertaken in the knowledge that the replication is the specific form that the moral response to the Berkeley decision takes in the institutional context that the 1% doctrine has identified as the context where the response is possible. Berkeley is the philosophical origin because it is where the doctrine's necessity was demonstrated, its problem was defined, its alternative was made legible, and its moral claim was grounded in the specific encounter with the specific institutional resistance that the doctrine was produced to address. The first campus will be built elsewhere, in the favorable conditions of the private development context that the 1% template is designed to deploy in. The doctrine originates in Berkeley, not in spite of the rejection. Because of it, the rejection is the origin. The parking lot is the provocation. The 5-year limit is the founding resistance. In the network that the doctrine produces, the global deployment of the transition campus template across the geographies of the post-scarcity transition is a specific civilizational response to the specific planning decision that a city made, in good faith and in the only vocabulary its institutional arrangement provided. When it was offered the first prototype of the post-scarcity civilization's spatial infrastructure and chose the parking lot instead. Berkeley will be remembered for the choice. Every campus in the network is the answer to it. 32. Private development as first implementation. The history of civilizational infrastructure is the history of unlikely first movers. The cathedral was not built first by the church as an institutional actor deploying centrally organized resources toward a centrally planned architectural program. It was built first by the specific combination of local episcopal ambition, merchant patronage, craft guild organization, and popular devotion that the specific conditions of the specific medieval city happened to generate. The unlikely alignment of motivated actors across different institutional positions whose combined resources and combined motivations were sufficient to undertake what no single actor could have undertaken alone. The church provided the theological framework and the institutional legitimacy. The merchant provided the capital. The guild provided the technical capacity. The popular devotion provided the labor and the sustained community commitment across the generations of construction that the cathedral required. None of these actors was the obviously correct first mover. The church had the theological claim, but frequently lacked the concentrated capital. The merchant had the capital, but lacked the institutional legitimacy. The guild had the technical capacity, but lacked the resources. The popular devotion had the sustained commitment, but lacked the organizational capacity to direct it. The cathedral was built by the specific combination that the specific conditions produced, not by the actor that the institutional logic of the medieval world would have identified as the obviously correct builder of the civilization's primary building type. The factory was not built first by the state as the obvious institutional actor for the coordination of industrial production. It was built first by the specific combination of entrepreneurial capital, engineering innovation, colonial resource extraction, and the specific legal and regulatory environment that the English common law tradition happened to provide, the unlikely alignment that produced in the specific conditions of the English Midlands in the late 18th century. The first instances of the industrial production system that would eventually reorganize the entire world's productive infrastructure. The state did not build the factory. The state eventually regulated the factory, taxed the factory, organized the labor relations of the factory, and eventually built the public infrastructure, the roads, the railways, the educational systems that the factory required to operate at scale. But the state was not the first mover. The entrepreneurial capital and the engineering innovation and the specific legal environment were the first movers. The unlikely combination that produced the first instances of the industrial civilization's primary productive infrastructure in the conditions where the combination was possible before the institutional recognition of its necessity made it inevitable. The transition campus follows this pattern. The state is not the first mover of the 1% campus. The state will eventually, through the automation tax and the billionaire levy and the retraining infrastructure and the public cultural provision that the political economy of the transition will eventually produce, build the public versions of the transition campus at the scale that the displacement wave requires. The state's eventual role in the replication of the 1% template is not in question. It is certain in the specific sense that the social and political pressure generated by the scale of the cognitive equalization's displacement will eventually compel the state's institutional machinery to produce the institutional response that the displacement requires. But the state is slow and the displacement is fast. And the interval between the displacement speed and the state's response is the interval in which the first movers must act, in which the unlikely combination of motivated actors whose resources and motivations align in the specific conditions of the current moment must produce the first instances of the transition civilization's primary spatial and governance infrastructure before the institutional recognition of its necessity makes it inevitable. Private development is the first mover of the 1% campus for the same reason that the entrepreneurial capitalist was the first mover of the factory. Not because private development is the ideally suited institutional actor for the production of civilizational infrastructure. It is not, and the 1% doctrine does not claim that it is. But because private development is the institutional actor that has the specific combination of motivated interest, available capital, operational speed, and regulatory freedom that the first implementation of the transition campus template requires in the specific conditions of the current moment. The motivated interest is the differentiation premium that the genuine transition campus provides in the luxury development market. The specific competitive advantage that the doctrinally grounded, architecturally ambitious, governmentally sophisticated transition campus generates for the development that embeds it. In the market segment where differentiation is the primary competitive variable and the authentic story is the differentiation that no competitor can replicate without also replicating the doctrine that produced it. The available capital is the surplus that luxury development generates at the margins that the 1% allocation can be drawn from without threatening the development's economic viability. The specific fraction of the development's resources that the 1% rule identifies as available for non-economic allocation and that the luxury development's economics can sustain as a genuine permanent commitment rather than a temporary gesture. The operational speed is the private developer's capacity to move from design decision to groundbreaking within a planning cycle. The specific institutional speed that the displacement's urgency requires and that the state's deliberative processes cannot match in the interval between the displacement's current speed and the institutional recognition of the landing structure's necessity. The regulatory freedom is the private developer's exemption from the specific form of the scarcity-era planning system's resistance that the Berkeley encounter made precise. The exemption from the 5-year limit and the parking fallback and the reversibility requirement that the planning board's institutional mandate produced. The exemption that allows the private developer's design decision to make the transition campus permanent without submitting the permanence to the institutional review. that the public planning process would apply. These four properties, motivated interest, available capital, operational speed, and regulatory freedom, are the specific properties that the first implementation of the 1% template requires. And they're the specific properties that private luxury development in the current moment happens to possess in the combination that the first implementation needs. This is not an endorsement of private luxury development as the ideal long-term steward of the transition civilization's spatial and governance infrastructure. The 1% doctrine is explicit about the limitations of private development as an institutional steward, its commercial imperatives, its exit orientation, its accountability to investors rather than to the communities it serves, its tendency toward the capture of governance functions in the interest of the development's commercial priorities. These limitations are real, and they are addressed in the doctrine's governance architecture through the specific mechanisms that protect the campus's operational independence from the host development's commercial management. It is a recognition that the first implementation requires the specific properties that private luxury development happens to possess in the current moment, that no other available institutional actor possesses in the same combination, and that the first implementation cannot wait for the ideal long-term steward to develop the institutional capacity that would make it the appropriate first mover. The first mover is not the ideal steward. It is the available actor whose specific properties align with the specific requirements of the first implementation in the specific conditions of the current moment. This is the consistent pattern of civilizational infrastructure's first implementations. The available actor rather than the ideal steward, the specific alignment of properties rather than the institutional perfection that would make the alignment unnecessary. The transition from the first mover to the ideal long-term steward is the next institutional phase, the phase that follows the first implementation's demonstration of the template's viability and precedes the state's eventual formalization of the public institutional infrastructure that the scale of the displacement will require. How does the first implementation's private development context shape the template's specific form? It shapes the template's spatial context. The luxury development context determines the specific geography of the first implementations. The resort communities of Tulum and Bali and the Algarve, the mixed-use developments of the tech-adjacent urban markets of California and the Pacific Northwest and Western Europe, the branded residential communities of the global high-net-worth population's preferred destinations. These are not the geographies of the most acute displacement. The communities most severely impacted by the cognitive equalization's displacement wave are not the luxury resort communities of the global rich. They are the mid-sized cities of the industrial Midwest and the service economy suburbs of the major coastal metros and the secondary cities of the developing world whose white-collar professional class is being dissolved by the same AI tools that are dissolving the professional class everywhere. The first implementations in the luxury development context are therefore not in the geographies where the need is greatest. They are in the geographies where the first implementation is possible, where the available capital and the motivated interest and the operational speed and the regulatory freedom combine to make the first instance buildable. This geographic displacement between the first implementation's location and the greatest needs location is the specific ethical challenge that the first mover's institutional character generates. The 1% doctrine addresses it not by pretending the displacement does not exist. It exists and the doctrine acknowledges it, but by understanding it as the necessary topology of civilizational infrastructure's development. The first instances are built where the capacity to build them is concentrated. In the template, they demonstrate migrates to the geographies of greatest need through the replication mechanisms that the network provides. The first cathedral was not built in the poorest parish. The first factory was not built in the most economically distressed region. The first university was not built in the community with the least existing educational provision. The first instance is built where the conditions for building it are present, and the institutional form it demonstrates migrates to the geographies that the institutional form is ultimately designed to serve. The luxury development context-specific geography is therefore not a compromise of the doctrine's moral claim. It is the topological necessity of the first implementation's institutional character, the necessary starting point of a migration that the replication template is designed to accomplish. It shapes the template's architectural ambition. The luxury development context is the context where architectural ambition is most immediately available, where the capital exists, the client expects it, the market rewards it, and the design culture that serves the luxury market is organized around the production of the architecturally distinctive rather than the architecturally adequate. The Dreamcatcher installation at the center of the first 1% campus will be the world's largest and most architecturally ambitious public artwork of its generation, because it is being built in the context where the capital for that ambition is available and where the differentiation premium that the ambition generates is the primary commercial justification for the capital's allocation. The ambition is not gratuitous. It is the specific form that the luxury development context available capital takes when it is directed toward the 1% allocation rather than toward the additional amenity that would generate a more straightforwardly measurable return. The architectural ambition of the first implementation is the template's most visible advertisement. The specific form in which the transition campus announces its existence to the world attracts the attention of the institutions and governments and communities that will eventually replicate it, and establishes the visual and spatial vocabulary that subsequent implementations will recognize as the template's identifying signature, even as they adapt it to the specific conditions of their specific contexts. The architectural ambition is therefore not separable from the replication function. It is the first implementation's specific contribution to the template's legibility as a template, the visual and spatial demonstration that the transition campus is not a marginal institutional form, but a civilizational proposition of the first order, deserving of the architectural attention and the spatial ambition that civilizational propositions have always commanded. It shapes the template's governance demonstration. The luxury development context is also the context where the governance demonstration has the most visible audience, where the global creative and intellectual and financial class that moves through the luxury resort communities of Tulum and Bali and the Algarve will encounter the dream validation process in operation, will observe the cross-class community of the transition campus in the daily practice of its non-hierarchical governance, will experience the spatial quality of the being, surface, and the symbolic authority of the Dreamcatcher, and will carry the encounter back to the institutional context where they exercise their own governance authority. The first implementation's governance demonstration is not only for the community that directly inhabits the campus. It is for the audience that the luxury development context provides: the investors, the developers, the architects, the cultural institution directors, the government officials, the foundation presidents, the technology executives who move through the luxury development's world, and who, in encountering the 1% campus in that world, are encountering the governance proposition that the doctrine describes in the specific form of a working institution rather than a theoretical argument. This audience is the mechanism of the template's early replication, not the state's eventual formalization of the public institutional infrastructure, not the network's systematic deployment of the template through organizational channels, but the specific individual encounters of the influential actors who observe the first implementation in operation and carry the template's demonstration back to the institutional context where their influence can accelerate its replication. The luxury development context audience is therefore not incidental to the replication function. It is the first implementation's specific contribution to the template's early spread before the institutional recognition of its necessity produces the organizational mechanisms of systematic replication. It shapes the template's economic demonstration. The luxury development context is the context where the economic demonstration of the 1% allocation's value is most immediately legible, where the differentiation premium that the genuine transition campus generates is measurable in the specific market terms that the luxury development industry understands and communicates, where the brand gravity and the cultural capital and the narrative authority that the transition campus produces for the host development can be assessed against. The cost of the 1% allocation and the assessment can be communicated in the language of return on investment that the industry speaks. The economic demonstration that the first implementation provides. The specific evidence that the genuine transition campus generates differentiation premium that justifies the 1% allocation in the specific economic terms of the luxury development market is the economic argument for the template's replication by other developers in the same market segment, not the moral argument, which the doctrine makes independently of the economic demonstration, not the architectural argument, which the dreamcatcher's ambition makes independently of the economic return. The specific economic demonstration that the 1% allocation to the genuine transition campus is not a philanthropic sacrifice of return, but a strategic investment in the differentiation that the luxury market rewards. This economic demonstration is the template's argument in a language that the first mover's institutional character is designed to understand. The language of return and differentiation and competitive advantage that the luxury development industry speaks. And it is the argument that will produce the early replication of the template within the luxury development industry before the template has demonstrated its viability in the public institutional context that will eventually formalize it. Together, the spatial context, the architectural ambition, the governance demonstration, and the economic demonstration. These four contributions of the luxury development first implementation constitute the template's early authority in the specific institutional context where early replication is possible. They are the contributions of the first mover, not the ideal long-term steward, but the available actor whose specific properties align with the specific requirements of the first implementation in the specific conditions of the current moment. The cathedral's merchant patron was not the ideal long-term steward of the cathedral's governance. The factory's entrepreneurial capitalist was not the ideal long-term steward of the industrial production system's social organization. The 1% campus's luxury developer is not the ideal long-term steward of the transition civilization's spatial and governance infrastructure. But the merchant patron built the cathedral. The entrepreneurial capitalist built the factory. And the luxury developer will build the first 1% campuses. Not because they are ideal, because they are available, because they have the specific properties that the first implementation requires in the specific conditions of the current moment. Because the first implementation cannot wait for the ideal steward to develop the institutional capacity that would make the first implementation possible on the ideal steward's own terms. The first mover builds the first instance. The first instance demonstrates the template. The template migrates to the geographies and the institutional context that the first instance's conditions could not reach. The migration produces the network. The network produces the scale that the state eventually formalizes as the public institutional infrastructure of the transition civilization. That is the sequence. Private development is the first step, not the last, not the ideal, the first. And the first step is the only step that cannot be taken by the institutional actors that the subsequent steps require. The state cannot take the first step at the state speed without missing the interval that the displacement's urgency defines. The philanthropic foundation cannot take the first step at the scale that the architectural ambition and the governance demonstration require. The community organization cannot take the first step with the capital and the operational speed and the regulatory freedom that the first implementation needs. Only the private luxury developer, in the specific conditions of the current moment, has the specific combination of properties that the first step requires. The step is being taken. In Tulum and in the adjacent geographies of the global luxury development market, where the conditions align and the motivated interest is present and the capital is available and the operational speed is achievable and the regulatory freedom is real. The first 1% campus is being built, not yet in the geographies of greatest need, but in the geographies where it can be built now. And from those geographies, the template will migrate through the network, through the replication, through the institutional recognition that the first implementations will produce to the geographies where it will eventually be most necessary. That is the first implementation's promise. delivered by the unlikely first mover, demonstrated in the favorable conditions, deployed toward the unfavorable ones. The cathedral's first patron was not the poorest parishioner. The campus's first developer is not the most displaced community. But the cathedral eventually served every parish, and the campus will eventually serve every displaced community. That is what templates do. That is what the first implementation is for. 33. Exporting the model globally. Models do not travel the way goods travel. A manufactured object moves from its point of production to its point of consumption through the specific logistics of supply chain and distribution network and retail infrastructure. The physical movement of the object across the distance between where it was made and where it will be used, preserving in that movement the specific form that the production process gave it. The object that arrives at the consumer is, within the tolerances of the logistics system, the same object that left the factory. Its form is fixed. Its replication is the reproduction of that fixed form at the scale that the production system can achieve. A model moves differently. A model travels through the minds of the people who encounter it, through the specific cognitive and social process by which a person who has observed or inhabited or governed within a working instance of the model develops the understanding of the model's governing logic that makes her capable of building the next instance in the specific conditions of her specific context. The model that arrives in the next context is not the same model that left the first instance. It has been filtered through the understanding of the person who carried it, adapted to the specific conditions of a new context, modified by the specific challenges that the new context presents, refined by the specific insights that the encounter between the model's governing logic and the new context's specific conditions generates. This is why the most important thing that the first implementation of the 1% template produces is not the campus itself, not the Dreamcatcher installation, not the transition campus's buildings and infrastructure and governance mechanisms, not even the community of people whose participation in the campus's collective life is developing the new civic mind. All of these are real and all of them matter. But the most important thing that the first implementation produces is the people who have understood the model's governing logic through the specific experience of building and inhabiting and governing the first instance. The people who carry the model's governing logic in their embodied understanding of what the model is, what it requires, and how it adapts to conditions different from the first instance's specific conditions. These people are the model's primary export, not the design documentation. Though the design documentation matters, and the 1% network will develop the specific documentation that subsequent implementations require, not the governance architecture. Though the governance architecture is central to the model's coherence, and the network will develop the specific tools that make the governance architecture transferable across institutional and cultural contexts. Not even the doctrine. Though the doctrine is the intellectual foundation that gives the model's replication its conceptual authority, and that this publication is designed to establish in advance of the first implementation's completion. The people who have built and inhabited and governed the first instance, who have developed, through the sustained engagement with the model's actual operation in actual conditions, the embodied understanding of what the model's governing logic requires when it encounters the specific resistance that specific contexts generate. These are the model's primary export, the mechanism through which the model's governing logic travels to the next context and the context after that. This is the mechanism of every successful model's global export. The Benedictine monastery did not export the monastic model through the distribution of rule of Saint Benedict texts alone, though the text was central to the model's coherence and traveled with the monks who carried it. It exported the model through the monks themselves, through the specific people who had inhabited the first monasteries and who carried, in their embodied understanding of what the rule required in practice, the governing logic that made it possible to build the next monastery in the specific conditions of the next geography. The university did not export the university model through the distribution of institutional charters alone, though the charter was central to the model's legal coherence and traveled with the scholars who carried it. It exported the model through the scholars, through the specific people who had inhabited Oxford and Bologna and Paris and who carried, in their embodied understanding of what the university's governance and curriculum and social organization require in practice. The governing logic that made it possible to build the next university in the specific conditions of the next kingdom. The 1% network will export the transition campus model through the same mechanism, through the people who have built and inhabited and governed the first instances and who carry, in their embodied understanding of what the dream validation process requires in practice, what the being surface needs spatially, what the cross-class community demands socially, what the non-hierarchical authority structure produces governmentally, the governing logic that makes it possible to build the next campus in the specific conditions of the next geography. The global export of the 1% model is therefore, at its foundation, the specific challenge of developing the people who can carry the governing logic to the next geography, and of designing the first instance's operation in a way that produces those people through the sustained engagement with the model's actual implementation rather than through the instruction in the model's theoretical description. This distinction between the people who understand the model through embodied engagement with its actual operation and the people who understand the model through instruction in its theoretical description is the distinction between the capable replicator and the inadequate one. The person who has read the doctrine but has not inhabited the campus can describe the dream validation process with accuracy. She cannot navigate the specific failure modes that the dream validation process generates in the specific social conditions of a specific community, cannot recognize the block formation that is beginning to capture the filtering stage, cannot identify the competence display that is substituting for genuine contribution in the weaving stage, cannot sense the moment when the temporal filtering is being gamed by the community members with the most institutional experience. These recognitions require the embodied understanding that only sustained engagement with the model's actual operation produces. The 1% network's global export strategy is therefore organized, primarily, around the development of the embodied understanding that capable replication requires, through the specific mechanisms that the network designs to produce replicators rather than merely to produce campuses. The first mechanism is the founding community's deliberate dispersal. The founding community of the first 1% campus, the people who built and inhabited and governed the first instance through its first years of operation, is the network's most valuable replication resource. Their embodied understanding of the model's governing logic, developed through the sustained engagement with the first instance's actual challenges, is irreplaceable in the early years of the network's development, when no alternative source of that understanding yet exists. The founding community is therefore not designed to remain permanently concentrated in the first campus. It is designed, from the beginning of the first campus's operation, with the deliberate intention of its eventual dispersal, the movement of founding community members into the founding teams of subsequent campuses, carrying their embodied understanding to the new context where subsequent campuses are being built. This dispersal is not loss. The founding community members who move to subsequent campuses are not leaving the model. They are becoming the model's primary export mechanism, carrying its governing logic to the context where the next instances will be built. The first campus is not diminished by their departure. It has, by the time the dispersal begins, developed the institutional memory and the governance capacity that makes the founding community members' departure survivable, and it receives, through the network relationships that the dispersal produces, the understanding that the subsequent campuses develop in their specific conditions as an enrichment of the first campus's own institutional learning. The deliberate dispersal of the founding community is the 1% network-specific version of the mechanism that every successful model's global export has used, the deliberate deployment of the people who embody the governing logic to the context where the governing logic needs to be embodied next. The second mechanism is the network's apprenticeship structure. The person who will build the next campus, who is currently in the process of identifying the conditions that make the next campus possible, developing the relationships with the private development or the public institution or the philanthropic foundation that will provide the resources, and beginning the design process that will eventually produce the next instance, needs the embodied understanding that the founding community possesses before the next campus opens, not after. The network's apprenticeship structure provides this through the specific institutional arrangement of extended residency in the first campus. The sustained engagement with the first campus's actual operation that the future founder undertakes before beginning the development of the next instance. Not a site visit, not a consulting engagement, a genuine residency, a period of months during which the future founder inhabits the first campus's community, participates in its governance through the dream validation process, observes the specific failure modes that the first campus's operation has encountered and the specific adaptations that the community has developed in response, and develops the embodied understanding of the model's governing logic that the sustained engagement with the actual operation produces. The apprenticeship residency is the mechanism through which the network transfers the embodied understanding from the founding community to the replicators. The specific institutional form through which the governing logic travels from the people who developed it through the first instance's actual operation to the people who will deploy it in the next instance's specific conditions. The apprenticeship structure is demanding. It requires the future founder to invest months in the first campus's residency before beginning the development of her own instance, which delays the second instance's opening and imposes a significant time cost on the future founder's institutional agenda. But it is the specific investment that distinguishes the capable replicator from the inadequate one, the investment that produces the embodied understanding that makes the next instance genuinely the model's continuation rather than an institutional adaptation that preserves the model's vocabulary while dissolving its governing logic. The network enforces the apprenticeship requirement not through regulatory authority. The network has no regulatory authority over the institutions that choose to adopt the 1% template, but through the doctrine's sovereign authorship. The institution that adopts the 1% template without the apprenticeship residency is adopting the vocabulary without the governing logic, and the doctrine's sovereign authorship makes the distinction legible to the audiences whose assessment of the institution's claim to the template's authority matters. The institution that claims to be in 1% campus without having produced its founding team through the apprenticeship structure is making a claim that the network's institutional memory and the doctrine's public record can assess. And the assessment, made through the network's governance rather than through any external regulatory process, determines whether the institution's claim to the template's authority is recognized. The third mechanism is the doctrine's public sovereignty. The doctrine that this publication establishes is the 1% model's most durable export mechanism, the mechanism that operates independently of the people who carry the governing logic, that remains in the world as the intellectual authority of the model's governing logic after every founding community member has moved to the next context and after every apprentice has developed her own embodied understanding and deployed it in her own next instance. The doctrine's public sovereignty is the guarantee that the model's governing logic cannot be dissolved by institutional adaptation, that the 1% template's identifying commitments are preserved against the specific failure mode of institutional drift, the gradual redefinition of the template's requirements in the image of the institution's own priorities rather than the model's governing logic. Every successful model's global export has encountered the failure mode of institutional drift, the tendency of subsequent instances to preserve the model's vocabulary while dissolving its governing logic in the specific conditions of the new context. The Benedictine monastery that gradually became a feudal landowner while retaining the monastic vocabulary. The university that gradually became a credential factory while retaining the scholarly vocabulary. The democracy that gradually became a managed oligarchy while retaining the democratic vocabulary. In each case, the drift was not the result of bad faith. The institutions that drifted believed themselves to be faithful to the model whose vocabulary they retained. The drift was the result of the accumulated pressure of the specific conditions of the new context on the model's governing logic, pressure that the model's vocabulary could resist for a time, but that eventually reshaped the governing logic in the image of the context. The doctrine's public sovereignty is the 1% model's specific resistance to institutional drift, The specific mechanism through which the model's governing logic is preserved as a public intellectual authority against the accumulated pressure of the new context-specific conditions. The doctrine defines, in public and with the intellectual precision that the doctrine's conceptual architecture provides, the specific commitments that constitute the 1% template. The dream validation process is five-stage governance architecture, the being surface, four qualities, the non-hierarchical authorities, four mechanisms, the economic substrates, five mechanisms, the new civic minds, five capacities. These definitions are public. They are sovereign, established by the doctrine's authorship rather than by any institution's adoption. And they're the standard against which any institution's claim to be a genuine 1% campus can be assessed by any observer who has read the doctrine and observed the institution's actual practice. The doctrine's public sovereignty does not prevent institutions from adapting the template to their specific conditions. Adaptation is both necessary and desirable, and the doctrine explicitly recognizes that subsequent instances will develop the model in ways that the first instance's specific conditions did not produce. But it distinguishes between the adaptation that develops the model's governing logic in new conditions and the adaptation that dissolves the governing logic in the image of the new context-specific pressures. The distinction that the apprenticeship structures embodied understanding provide for the founding team, and that the doctrine's public sovereignty provide for the wider audience that is assessing the institution's fidelity to the template. The fourth mechanism is the network's shared institutional memory. The AI system that maintains the campus's institutional memory, described in Chapter 13 as the memory function of the AI-amplified governance architecture, is not only the first campus's governance resource. It is the network's collective intelligence infrastructure, the mechanism through which the specific insights and specific adaptations and specific failure modes that each campus encounters in its specific conditions are made available to every other campus in the network. The network's shared institutional memory is the model's self-improving export mechanism, the mechanism through which the model becomes more sophisticated with each subsequent instance, incorporating the specific knowledge that each new context generates into the shared understanding of the model's governing logic that the network's collective intelligence embodies. The first campus develops the model's governing logic through the specific challenges of its specific context. The second campus inherits the first campus's institutional knowledge and develops the model further through the specific challenges of its specific context. The third campus inherits the institutional knowledge of both the first and the second and develops the model further through its own specific challenges. The network's shared institutional memory is the mechanism through which this cumulative development is preserved and made accessible, through which the model grows more capable with each subsequent instance, rather than starting over from the first principles that each new founding team must rediscover independently. This is the global export's most powerful long-term mechanism, not the dispersal of founding community members, not the apprenticeship structure, not even the doctrine's public sovereignty, but the network's self-improving collective intelligence that makes each subsequent instance of the model the beneficiary of every preceding instance's specific learning. The model that is exported to the 100 context is a significantly more sophisticated model than the model that was exported to the second context. Not because the governing logic has changed, but because the network's shared institutional memory has encoded across the experience of 99 specific implementations in 99 specific contexts, the specific adaptations and the specific failure modes and the specific innovations that the governing logics encounter with 99 different sets of conditions has produced. This cumulative sophistication is the global export's ultimate competitive advantage over the institutional alternatives, over the state's replication of the model through the public institutional infrastructure that the political economy of the transition will eventually produce, and over the institutional imitation of the model by the organizations that adopt the vocabulary without the apprenticeship that produces the governing logic's embodied understanding. The network's shared institutional memory is the mechanism through which the genuine 1% campus is always more sophisticated than its imitations. not because the imitations lack the intelligence of their founders, but because the genuine campus has access to the accumulated learning of the network's full institutional experience, and the imitation does not. The fifth mechanism is the model's cultural legibility. The 1% model's global export is not only the institutional deployment of the template in specific contexts by the people who have developed the embodied understanding of its governing logic. It is also the cultural spread of the model's conceptual vocabulary, the terms and the images and the narratives that the doctrine has established as the intellectual property of the transition civilization's spatial and governance imagination. The transition campus, the dream validation process, the being surface, the new civic mind, the post-professional identity, meaning infrastructure, the post-scarcity bridge. These are the terms that the doctrine establishes as the 1% model's conceptual vocabulary, the specific intellectual property that constitutes the model's cultural identity, and that, once established in public discourse through the doctrine's publication and the first implementation's demonstration, becomes the cultural currency through which the model's governing logic travels in the minds of the people who have not yet encountered the model in institutional form, but who are already thinking about the transition civilization's spatial and governance requirements. The cultural legibility of the model's vocabulary is the mechanism through which the model's governing logic reaches the context where the institutional deployment has not yet arrived, where the developer who is considering the design of the next luxury resort in Bali, or the government minister who is developing the next phase of urban regeneration in Lagos, or the foundation president who is considering the next major cultural investment in Sao Paulo, has encountered the doctrines, vocabulary in the public discourse, and is already thinking about the 1% model's governing logic before the network's institutional presence in their specific context has been established. This cultural spread of the vocabulary is not a substitute for the institutional deployment. The developer who has read the doctrine, but whose founding team has not completed the apprenticeship residency, is not in a position to build a genuine 1% campus, for the reasons the preceding section has described. But it is the cultural preparation for the institutional deployment, the specific form of intellectual groundwork that the doctrine's publication and the first implementation's public demonstration provide, that makes the institutional deployment possible when the network's presence reaches the specific context that the cultural vocabulary has already prepared. The global export of the 1% model is therefore a multi-layered process, operating simultaneously through the institutional mechanisms of founding community dispersal and apprenticeship structure and doctrine sovereignty and network shared memory, and through the cultural mechanism of the vocabulary spread in public discourse. The institutional mechanisms produce the genuine campuses, the specific implementations of the model that deploy its governing logic in specific conditions with the embodied understanding that capable replication requires. The cultural mechanism produces the readiness, the specific intellectual preparation of the context where the genuine campuses have not yet arrived, but where the cultural currency of the model's vocabulary is already present in the minds of the actors whose resources and motivations and institutional positions could make the next genuine campus possible. The institutional mechanisms and the cultural mechanism operate at different speeds and across different distances. The institutional mechanisms move at the speed of the founding community's dispersal and the apprenticeship structure's preparation and the network's organizational development. The speed of human institutional processes, which is faster than the state but slower than the cultural discourse. The cultural mechanism moves at the speed of ideas in an information environment where the cognitive equalization has made the barriers to the spread of compelling intellectual frameworks lower than they have ever been. The speed of the AI-amplified discourse, which is faster than any institutional process and which reaches contexts that the institutional mechanisms have not yet reached. Together, they constitute the complete export mechanism of the 1% model, the specific combination of institutional depth and cultural breadth that the global replication of a civilizational infrastructure template requires. The depth without breadth produces a model that is rigorously implemented in the specific context that the institutional mechanisms reach and invisible to the vastly larger set of contexts that the institutional mechanisms have not yet organized the capacity to serve. The breadth without depth produces a model that is widely discussed and frequently imitated in the specific context that the cultural mechanism reaches and rarely genuinely implemented in the form that the governing logic requires. The depth and the breadth together produce a model that is both genuinely implemented in the context where the institutional mechanisms have organized the capacity for genuine implementation and culturally present in the vastly larger set of contexts where the cultural mechanism has prepared the ground for the institutional mechanism's eventual arrival. That combination is the 1% model's global export in its complete form. Not the distribution of a fixed institutional form across the geographies of the post-scarcity transition, the factory's replication through the deployment of the same productive technology in new geographies, but the migration of a governing logic through the minds of the people who carry it, the cathedral's replication through the monks who carried the rule to the next monastery and the next kingdom and the next civilization, adapting it to the specific conditions of each context while preserving the governing logic that made each adaptation recognizable as the continuation of the model rather than the institution of something new. The 1% model is the rule for the transition civilization's spatial and governance infrastructure. This doctrine is the rule's first written form. The first campus is the rule's first working monastery. And the network that the first campus produces through the dispersal of its founding community, the apprenticeship of its replicators, the sovereignty of its doctrine, the collective intelligence of its shared memory, and the cultural spread of its vocabulary, is the civilization-wide deployment of the rule that the transition civilization requires. The model is ready for export. The world is ready to receive it. The only question remaining is the speed of the delivery, the specific race between the urgency of the displacement and the capacity of the network to deploy the landing structure before the interval between the displacement speed and the institutional recognition of its necessity produces the social consequences that the undesigned transition historically generates. The network is faster than the state. The doctrine is faster than the network. The displacement is faster than all of them. That is the urgency. That is why the export begins now. 34. The network of transition campuses. A network is not a collection. The distinction is precise, and its implications are architectural. A collection of transition campuses, individual instances of the 1% template deployed in specific contexts across the geographies of the post-scarcity transition, each operating according to the governing logic that the doctrine describes, each serving the specific displaced population of its specific context, would be a significant achievement. It would provide, across the geographies it reached, the landing structure that the displacement wave requires. It would demonstrate, through the accumulated evidence of multiple implementations, the template's viability across a range of conditions. It would constitute the body of evidence that the public institutional infrastructure of the transition civilization will eventually draw on in formalizing the transition campus as the standard response to the displacement wave's civilizational scale. A collection is significant. A network is something more. The network produces, through the specific relationships between its member campuses, the flows of institutional knowledge and people and governance, innovation, and cultural currency that the relationships enable, a collective intelligence that no individual campus and no collection of disconnected campuses can produce. The network's collective intelligence is not the sum of its member campuses' individual intelligences. It is the specific emergent property of the relationships between them. The new understanding that the encounter between the first campus's specific experience and the second campus's specific experience and the 100 campus's specific experience produces, through the network's shared institutional memory and the ongoing exchange that the network's governance facilitates. This emergent collective intelligence is the network's primary value over the collection, the specific thing that makes the investment in network architecture worth the cost and complexity that network architecture requires. And it is the specific thing that makes the 1% network's global replication not merely the multiplication of the landing structure across more geographies, but the development of the post-scarcity civilization's governance intelligence through the accumulated experience of multiple implementations in multiple conditions. The network is, in this sense, the collective learning system of the transition civilization's first institutional infrastructure, the mechanism through which the civilization learns, through the specific experience of building and operating and governing and adapting the transition campus in the full range of the conditions that the global transition presents. What the transition civilization's spatial and governance infrastructure actually requires as distinct from what the doctrines initial formulation assumed it would require. What does the network's architecture look like in the specific institutional form that the 1% doctrine proposes? The network is organized around the doctrine rather than around any central institutional authority. The 1% network is not a franchise. The specific institutional form through which the holder of a business model licenses its replication to operators who pay for the right to use the model's name and governance systems and supply chains, and who are held accountable to the model's requirements through the contractual authority of the franchisor. The franchise model produces institutional consistency through the control of the central authority over the specific practices of the licensed operators. It produces institutional dependence. The licensed operator's relationship to the franchisor's authority is the primary guarantee of her implementation's fidelity to the model and institutional uniformity. The successful franchise produces the same experience in every context because the franchisor's control ensures the replication of the same specific practices across every context. Neither consistency through central control nor the dependence and uniformity that the franchise model produces is appropriate for the 1% network. The transition campus's governing logic must be adapted to the specific conditions of each context. The dream validation process that works in Tulum must be modified for Lagos. The being surface that is appropriate for the Mediterranean climate must be redesigned for the Nordic one. The cross-class community that the specific social geography of a California tech-adjacent campus produces must be reconstituted for the specific social geography of a post-industrial Midlands campus. The central control that the franchise model uses to ensure consistency would prevent the specific adaptations that the governing logic's application to different contexts requires. The network is organized instead around the doctrine, the specific intellectual authority that the doctrine's publication establishes as the governing logic's public formulation. Every campus in the network is accountable to the doctrine rather than to any central institutional authority. Accountable to the specific commitments that the doctrine defines as the template's identifying features, assessed through the specific mechanisms of peer review and shared institutional memory and the cultural discourse that the doctrine's public sovereignty enables. This doctrine-centered governance is the network's specific solution to the consistency adaptability tension that every replication network faces. The doctrine provides consistency at the level of governing logic. The dream validation process is 5 stages, the being surface 4 qualities, the non-hierarchical authorities 4 mechanisms, the economic substrates 5 funding mechanisms. While leaving the specific institutional forms through which the governing logic is expressed in any specific context to the founding team's embodied understanding and the community's ongoing governance adaptation. The campus that is consistent at the level of governing logic and adaptive at the level of institutional form is the campus that is genuinely a member of the 1% network. The campus that the network's shared institutional memory recognizes as the continuation of the model rather than the institutional imitation that has adopted the vocabulary without the logic. The network is organized around the exchange of people rather than the exchange of documentation. The preceding chapter established that the model's primary export mechanism is the people who carry the governing logic in their embodied understanding. The founding community members who disperse to subsequent campuses, and the apprentices who develop the embodied understanding through the residency structure. This people-centered export is not only the mechanism of the network's founding. It is the ongoing mechanism of the network's coherence, the specific institutional arrangement through which the network maintains the governing logic's integrity across its member campuses through the sustained exchange of people rather than the periodic audit of documentation. The network's people exchange operates through three specific institutional forms. The first is the founding exchange, the deliberate dispersal of founding community members from established campuses to campuses in formation. The residency structure through which future founders develop the embodied understanding before building their own instances. This is the primary exchange, and it has been described in the preceding chapter. The second is the ongoing fellowship, the sustained exchange of community members between established campuses in the network. The specific institutional arrangement through which community members from one campus spend extended periods, weeks, months, in residence at another campus in a different geography and a different institutional context. The fellow who has spent 3 months in the Lagos campus after 3 years in the Tulum campus returns to Tulum with the specific understanding of what the governing logic requires in the conditions that the Lagos campus presents. The specific adaptations that the cross-class community's different class geography demanded, the specific modifications to the dream validation process that the different political economy of the public planning system required, the specific innovations in the being surface, spatial grammar that the different climate and the different relationship to outdoor life produced. This specific understanding is the network's ongoing enrichment. The specific knowledge that the governing logic's encounter with Lagos's conditions generates, made available to the Tulum campus's collective intelligence through the fellow's return. And the Tulum fellow who returns to Lagos carries the Tulum campus's specific understanding back to Lagos. The specific adaptations that the luxury development context conditions produced, the specific governance innovations that the founding community's particular combination of backgrounds generated, the specific cultural expressions of the governing logic that the Tulum campus's community developed. The ongoing fellowship produces a network in which the member campuses are not isolated experiments in the governing logic's application to specific conditions, but genuinely connected communities of practice. Communities whose specific experiences are made available to each other through the sustained exchange of the people who embody those experiences. The third is the founding team cross-pollination, the specific institutional arrangement through which the founding teams of campuses in formation are composed of people from multiple established campuses in the network rather than exclusively from the first campus's founding community. The founding team of the Sao Paulo campus draws its members from the Tulum campus's founding community and the Lagos campus's fellowship cohort and the network's apprenticeship graduates from the Nordic campus. The specific combination that brings the governing logic's application to 3 different contextual conditions to the formation of the fourth instance. This cross-pollination is the network's specific mechanism for accelerating the sophistication of subsequent implementations, for ensuring that each new campus begins its operation with the benefit of the governing logic's application to more conditions than the single context that any individual founding team's experience encompasses, and for preventing the specific failure mode of the single origin founding team whose governing logic has been shaped by the first instance's specific conditions and therefore carries into the new context the adaptations that the first instance's conditions required rather than the pure governing logic that the new context-specific conditions should shape. The network is organized around shared institutional memory as the primary governance infrastructure. The network's shared institutional memory, the AI system that maintains, across the full duration of the network's operation, the accumulated knowledge of every campus's specific experience with the governing logic's application to specific conditions, is the network's most important governance infrastructure and the specific mechanism through which the network produces collective intelligence rather than merely the collection of individual campus intelligences. The shared institutional memory receives, from every campus in the network, the specific knowledge that the campus's governance generates, the specific adaptations to the dream validation process that the campus's community has developed in response to the specific failure modes that the campus's specific conditions generated, The specific innovations in the being surface spatial grammar that the campus's architectural team developed in response to the specific climate and cultural relationship to outdoor space that the campus's geography presents, the specific modifications to the economic substrate that the campus's development context required, the specific expressions of non-hierarchical authority that the campus's specific cross-class community developed. This specific knowledge is not merely archived in the shared institutional memory. It is actively processed through the same AI functions of translation, connection, simulation, and memory that the individual campus's dream validation process deploys into the network's collective understanding of what the governing logic requires across the full range of conditions that the network's member campuses have encountered. The network's collective understanding is the resource that every founding team draws on in the design of the next campus. The specific knowledge of what has worked and what has failed in the conditions most similar to the conditions of the next implementation, made available through the shared institutional memories connection function to the specific aspects of the governing logic that the new context conditions most directly implicate. The network that has reached 50 campuses possesses, in its shared institutional memory, the accumulated knowledge of the governing logic's application to 50 different sets of conditions, the specific understanding of how the dream validation process adapts to the specific social geography of 50 different cross-class communities, how the being surface requires different spatial grammars in 50 different climatic and cultural relationships to outdoor life, how the economic substrate works across 50 different institutional contexts, ranging from the luxury resort to the post-industrial urban regeneration to the rural community development. This accumulated knowledge is the network's primary competitive advantage over any individual campus's governing logic, however sophisticated the individual campus's operation. The specific thing that makes the network's collective intelligence genuinely more capable of addressing the full range of conditions that the global transition presents than any individual campus's experience can produce. The network is organized around the governance of diversity as a specific collective challenge. The 1% network's member campuses will be, across the full range of the global transition geographies, more diverse than any single campus's community. Diverse in the specific class compositions of their communities, diverse in the cultural expressions of their governing logic, diverse in the specific institutional context that their host developments or public institutions or philanthropic foundations represent, diverse in the specific displacement waves that their specific geographies are experiencing at the specific moment of each campus's formation. This diversity is the network's most important resource and the network's most demanding governance challenge simultaneously. It is the most important resource because the governing logic's encounter with the full range of the global transition's diversity is the mechanism through which the network's collective intelligence develops the sophistication that the global transition requires. The governing logic that has only been applied to the conditions of the luxury resort development in the Mediterranean climate is not the governing logic that can address the conditions of the post-industrial urban campus in the Nordic winter or the rural community development in sub-Saharan Africa or to the tech-adjacent urban regeneration in East Asia. The network's diversity is the source of the governing logic's cumulative sophistication, the mechanism through which the template develops the range that the global transition's diversity requires. It is the most demanding governance challenge because the diversity that is the network's most important resource is also the diversity that the network's governance must manage without dissolving into the fragmentation that the specific failure mode of network diversity produces. The failure mode in which the network's member campuses, each adapting the governing logic to their specific conditions, develop adaptations that diverge from each other to the point where the governing logic's core commitments are no longer recognizable as the same governing logic across the full range of the network's implementations. The network's governance of diversity operates through the doctrine sovereignty, the specific mechanism described earlier through which the doctrine's public definition of the governing logic's core commitments provides the standard against which any campus's claim to be a genuine member of the 1% network can be assessed, regardless of the specific adaptations that the campus's specific conditions have required. But the doctrine's sovereignty is not sufficient on its own to govern the diversity of a network that spans the full range of the global transition's geographies and institutional contexts. The doctrine defines the governing logic's core commitments at the level of principle. The dream validation process is 5 stages, the being surface 4 qualities, and leaves the specific institutional forms through which the principles are expressed to the founding team's embodied understanding and the community's adaptation. The governance of the diversity within the space that the doctrine leaves to adaptation requires an additional governance mechanism, the network's peer review. The network's peer review is the specific institutional arrangement through which the member campuses assess each other's fidelity to the governing logic's core commitments as distinct from the adaptations that the governing logic permits. It is not the central authority's audit of the peripheral campus, not the franchisor's inspection of the licensed operator's compliance with the specific practices that the franchise agreement requires. It is the peer community's collective assessment of whether a member's adaptations remain within the space that the governing logic permits or whether they have dissolved the governing logic in the image of the specific context pressures. The peer review is conducted through the network's shared institutional memory, the specific mechanism through which the adaptation that a campus has developed in response to its specific conditions is made visible to the full network's collective intelligence, which can assess whether the adaptation develops the governing logic in new conditions or dissolves it in the image of those conditions. The assessment is not the judgment of any individual campus's authority over any other. It is the collective judgment of the network's shared understanding of the governing logic, expressed through the AI system's analysis of the adaptation's relationship to the doctrine's core commitments and the peer community's governance deliberation about the assessment's implications. The network's governance of diversity through the doctrine's sovereignty and the peer review's collective assessment is the specific mechanism through which the 1% network maintains the governing logic's integrity across the full range of the global transition's diversity, maintaining consistency at the level of core commitments while enabling the adaptation that the diversity of conditions requires and the sophistication that the encounter with diversity produces. The network produces the civilizational scale that no individual campus can reach. The individual campus serves the specific displaced population of its specific geography. It provides the landing structure for the hundreds of people who inhabit it at any given time, the thousands of people who pass through it across the years of its operation. It produces the governance, innovations, and the spatial model and the economic substrate and the new civic mind that the transition civilization requires in the specific conditions of its specific context. This is significant and it is insufficient. The displacement wave that the cognitive equalization is producing is not a displacement of hundreds or thousands. It is a displacement of hundreds of millions. The full scale of the professional and managerial class in every advanced economy. The full scale of the service and logistics and administrative workforce whose functions the AI tools are absorbing. The full scale of the knowledge work middle that the cognitive hierarchy organized and that the cognitive equalization is restructuring. No individual campus serves this scale. No collection of disconnected individual campuses serves this scale. Only the network of transition campuses at the civilizational scale that the displacement wave's civilizational scale demands, approaches the institutional capacity that the transition requires. The network's civilizational scale is not achieved by the 1% doctrine alone. It is the outcome of the doctrine's primary replication mechanism, the state's eventual formalization of the public institutional infrastructure of the transition campus, which the network's demonstration of the template's viability at the private development scale will eventually catalyze. The network of private development campuses is the demonstration that the state's formalization requires, the evidence that the transition campus model works, that it produces the landing structure that the displacement wave requires, that it generates the new civic mind that the transition civilization needs, that its economic architecture is sustainable and its governance architecture is scalable and its spatial model is replicable across the full range of conditions that the global transition presents. When the state formalizes the transition campus as the standard institutional response to the displacement wave, through the automation tax that funds the economic substrate, the planning regulations that mandate the transition campus's inclusion in developments above a certain scale, the educational infrastructure that produces the founding teams that the public campuses require. The network of private development campuses becomes the network seed layer, the first generation of implementations that demonstrated the template's viability and that provide the institutional knowledge the public campuses' founding teams will draw on in building the network's second generation. The seed layer and the public generation together constitute the network at the civilizational scale that the displacement wave requires, not the hundreds of campuses that the private development context can produce in the interval between the displacement's current speed and the state's eventual formalization, but the thousands and eventually the tens of thousands of campuses that the public institutional infrastructure's resources and reach can produce once the template's viability has been demonstrated at the private development scale. This is the network's ultimate contribution to the global transition, not the individual campuses, however significant their individual contributions, but the civilizational scale infrastructure that the network's full development eventually produces. The infrastructure of landing, the distributed network of spaces where the displaced can arrive, find community, develop post-professional identity, participate in the dream validation process, develop the new civic mind, and contribute to the governance of the transition civilization's collective life, available at the scale that the displacement wave's civilizational character demands. The network begins with the first campus. It is already in the first campus's founding, the network, because the first campus is not designed to be the only campus. It is designed to be the first node of the network, its operation shaped from the beginning by the network's eventual requirements, its governance adapted to the network's collective intelligence function, its founding community selected and developed with the network's dispersal function in mind. The first campus is the network's first instance. Every subsequent campus is the network's next instance. And the network, growing from the first instance through the subsequent instances through the public generation to the civilizational scale that the displacement wave demands, is the transition civilization's first complete institutional response to the civilizational challenge that the cognitive equalization has produced. Not a perfect response, not a sufficient response alone. The network operates alongside the state's institutional response and the market's adaptation and the cultural transformation that the new civic mind produces in every institutional context it enters. But the response that exists in the interval, the response that is available now, being built now, in the specific conditions that the current moment presents, before the ideal response is ready, before the state has formalized the public infrastructure, before the displacement wave has made the inadequacy of the existing institutional arrangements undeniable to every institutional actor that the adequate response requires. The network is the response that is possible now. And the response that is possible now is the response that determines what is possible later. That shapes the institutional landscape that the state's eventual formalization will inherit, that produces the founding teams that the public campus's second generation will draw on, that develops the governing logic sophistication through the accumulated experience of the private development scale's implementation. The first campus is the seed of a network. The network is the seed of the civilizational infrastructure. The civilizational infrastructure is the transition civilization's institutional foundation. It begins here, in the first campus, under the dream catcher, in the community that is already gathering. The network starts the moment the first campus opens its being surface to the first community member who arrives in the condition of displacement and discovers that the landing structure is real. That moment is the network's founding. Everything that follows is its growth. 35. The emergence of post-scarcity cities. Cities do not transform. They accumulate. This is the first and most important thing to understand about the emergence of the post-scarcity city. the specific form that the transition civilization's urban organization will eventually take as the network of transition campuses reaches the scale at which its presence begins to reshape the spatial and governance logic of the cities that contain it. The post-scarcity city does not replace the scarcity-era city through the kind of clean institutional substitution that the vocabulary of transformation implies. The old city removed, the new city installed, the transition accomplished through the specific act of replacement that produces the before and the after as legible, distinct conditions. Cities accumulate. The Roman infrastructure beneath the medieval streets. The medieval street pattern beneath the industrial city's expansion. The industrial cities building stock within the post-industrial cities, mixed use, reprogramming. Every urban era is present in the city that the subsequent era inhabits, present in the streets and the buildings and the infrastructure and the property boundaries and the institutional relationships and the cultural memories and the social geographies that the previous era's spatial decisions produced and that the subsequent era must work with, around, against, and through in building the spatial organization that its own conditions require. The post-scarcity city will accumulate on top of the scarcity city in the same way, will develop within the scarcity city's existing spatial organization, reprogramming the scarcity city's specific spatial forms for the post-scarcity city's specific purposes, converting the office tower into the participation hub, converting the shopping mall into the community commons, converting the surface parking lot into the being surface, converting the highway corridor into the mobility transitions. Autonomous fleet infrastructure, while retaining, because it cannot not retain them, because the city is an accumulation rather than a clean slate. The scarcity city's spatial forms in the specific proportions and the specific locations that the accumulation of previous decisions has produced. The post-scarcity city emerges from the scarcity city the way every new urban era has emerged from the one that preceded it. Not as the replacement of the previous era's spatial organization, but as the reinterpretation of it, the gradual accumulation of new spatial elements and new governance arrangements and new social geographies within the existing urban fabric, until the accumulation reaches the tipping point at which the new logic is more present in the city's daily life than the old one, and the city's self-understanding shifts to reflect the new predominance. The network of transition campuses is the primary mechanism of this accumulation in the urban geographies that the cognitive equalization's displacement wave is most acutely reshaping. The tech-adjacent cities of California and the Pacific Northwest, the post-industrial cities of the English Midlands and the Rust Belt, the rapidly urbanizing cities of the Global South where the professional class that the cognitive equalization is displacing is growing at the same time that the tools, dissolving its foundations, are becoming available. In each of these geographies, the emergence of the post-scarcity city follows the same topology that the network's development follows, beginning in the favorable conditions of the private development context and accumulating from those nodes of favorable conditions outward into the surrounding urban fabric. The governing logic of the transition campus spreading into the institutional landscape of the surrounding city through the specific mechanisms that the network's development produces. What are the specific mechanisms through which the transition campus's accumulation in the city produces the emergence of the post-scarcity city? The first mechanism is spatial contagion. The transition campus's being surface, the generous, temporally available, sensorially rich, spatially grammatical surface designed for human being rather than for the movement or the production or the transaction that the scarcity city's primary spatial forms are organized around, is the most immediately visible element of the campus's spatial proposition, and the element that most directly challenges the scarcity city's spatial logic in the public perception of what urban space is for. The person who has experienced the being surface of the transition campus, who has inhabited the specific quality of the campus's outdoor space, who has felt the specific experience of being in a space organized around her presence rather than her transit, who has discovered in the campus's temporal availability the specific liberation of the urban space that does not expire at the close of business, carries that experience back into the surrounding city and measures every subsequent urban space against it. This experience-based comparison is the mechanism of spatial contagion, the specific process through which the quality of the campus's being surface begins to reshape the standards that the city's population applies to the surrounding urban space, creating the demand for the being surface qualities in the spaces that the campus's spatial contagion has reached. The spatial contagion is not an argument. It is an experience, and the experience is more powerful as a mechanism of urban change than the argument, because the experience produces the specific cognitive and emotional shift in the standards that the urban population applies to the spatial quality of public space that no argument about the desirability of post-scarcity spatial organization can produce without the experiential foundation. The city whose population has experienced the being surface of a transition campus is a city whose population is generating, through the accumulated pressure of the experience-based comparison, the demand for the being surface qualities in the spaces that the campus's spatial contagion has reached. This demand is expressed through the specific political and planning and development pressures that urban populations generate when the gap between the spatial quality they have experienced and the spatial quality that the surrounding city provides becomes sufficiently large to motivate the specific form of civic engagement that the gap produces. The Planning Commission that begins to receive proposals for the reprogramming of surface parking lots as being surfaces in the neighborhoods adjacent to the city's transition campus is receiving the spatial contagion's political expression. The specific form of civic engagement that the experience-based comparison produces when the gap between the experience quality and the surrounding quality motivates the population to act. The developer who begins to incorporate being surface qualities into the public realm of new developments in the neighborhoods where the spatial contagion has reached is responding to the market signal that the spatial contagion produces, the specific demand that the experience-based comparison has generated in the populations that the campus's spatial quality has reached. The city that has 3 transition campuses has 3 nodes of spatial contagion. 3 points from which the being surface qualities are spreading into the surrounding urban fabric through the experience-based comparison that the campus's population generates in every urban space it subsequently inhabits. The city that has 10 campuses has 10 nodes of spatial contagion, and the spatial quality that the contagion is spreading begins to reach the tipping point at which the being surface is more present in the city's public realm than the scarcity city's transit-optimized surfaces, at which the city's spatial self-understanding begins to shift from the scarcity city's movement organization to the post-scarcity city's being organization. The second mechanism is governance contagion. The dream validation process is not only the campus's governance mechanism. It is the governance model that the people who have participated in its operation carry back into every institutional context they subsequently inhabit, the specific governance intelligence that the new civic mind possesses and that it deploys in the governance of the surrounding city's institutions as the campus's community members move through the city's civic life. The dream validation process is 5 stages: submission, weaving, filtering, allocation, stewardship, are the specific governance architecture that the campus develops in its participants through the sustained practice of the transition campus's collective governance. When those participants move into the governance of the surrounding city, when the former campus community member sits on the city's planning commission, or leads the neighborhood association, or participates in the school board, or serves on the foundation's grant committee, she brings the dream validation process's governance intelligence with her. Not as the formal adoption of the dream validation process in the new institutional context. The Planning Commission cannot simply replace its existing governance procedures with the dream validation process's 5 stages without the institutional negotiation that any governance change requires, but as the specific governance disposition that the sustained practice of the dream validation process has developed, the genuine curiosity about the full range of specific knowledge relevant to a collective decision, the productive engagement with genuine disagreement rather than its suppression through the authority of the institutional position, the temporal perspective that considers the second and third order consequences of present decisions, the institutional creativity that recognizes when the existing governance mechanisms are inadequate to the specific challenge they face. These governance dispositions are the governance contagion's mechanism, the specific qualities that the new civic mind possesses and that reshape the governance of every institutional context the new civic mind enters. Not through the formal adoption of the campus's governance architecture, but through the accumulated pressure of the governance dispositions on the institutional culture of the context where the new civic minds are present. The city's planning commission that includes 3 former campus community members is not the same planning commission that existed before they arrived. Not because the commission has formally adopted the dream validation process, but because the governance culture of the commission is being reshaped through the accumulated pressure of 3 new civic minds governance dispositions toward the qualities that the campus's governance architecture develops: the genuine collective intelligence over the hierarchical authority, the productive disagreement over the suppressed consensus, the temporal perspective over the present horizon optimization. The governance contagion accumulates across every institutional context that the campus's community members enter, across the planning commissions and the school boards and the neighborhood associations and the foundation committees and the corporate governance structures and the government agencies that the new civic minds populate as they move through the city's civic life. The accumulation produces, over the years and decades of the campus's operation, a gradual reshaping of the city's governance culture toward the post-scarcity governance logic that the campus's architecture is designed to develop. Not through the formal replacement of the scarcity city's institutional structures with the post-scarcity city's governance architecture, but through the accumulated presence of the new civic mind's governance dispositions in the institutional cultures of the scarcity city's existing governance structures. The third mechanism is economic contagion. The campus's economic substrate, the 5 mechanisms of development allocation, embedded economy, network economy, philanthropic stream, and public funding stream that constitute the non-extractive revenue generation of the transition campus, is not only the campus's economic architecture. It is the economic model that the people who have participated in its operation carry back into the surrounding city's economic life. The specific economic intelligence that the new civic mind possesses and that it deploys in the economic life of the surrounding city. The embedded economy's specific innovation, the production of genuine surplus through the genuine exercise of genuine competence in the service of genuine collective need, without the extractive mechanisms that the scarcity economy has institutionalized as the primary revenue generation mechanisms, is the economic model that the campus's community members understand through the sustained experience of participating in it. When those community members return to the surrounding city's economic life, when the former campus community member starts a business, or joins a cooperative, or participates in a community development financial institution, or advises a social enterprise, she carries the embedded economy's economic intelligence with her. The non-extractive economic model spread through the surrounding city's economic life is the economic contagions mechanism, the specific process through which the campus's economic intelligence reaches the economic actors in the surrounding city and begins to reshape the economic culture of the city toward the non-extractive logic that the post-scarcity city's economics requires. The economic contagion is slower than the spatial contagion and the governance contagion. Economic cultures are more resistant to change than spatial standards and governance dispositions, because they are more directly connected to the immediate material interests of the actors who must change them. But it is real, and it accumulates through the sustained presence of the new civic mind's economic intelligence in the city's economic life, through the businesses that the former campus community members found on the embedded economy's principles, the cooperatives they join on the non-extractive network economy's principles, the investment decisions they make on the economic substrate's principles. The fourth mechanism is social geography contagion. The campus's cross-class community, the specific social formation that the cognitive parity environment produces, the specific experience of inhabiting a social world in which the scarcity city's class boundaries and professional distinctions and cultural consumption markers do not organize the social recognition that the campus's community generates, reshapes the social geography of the surrounding city as the campus's community members carry the cross-class social intelligence back into the city's residential neighborhoods and social institutions. The cross-class social intelligence is the specific social knowledge that the campus's community develops through the sustained inhabitation of the cognitive parity environment. The knowledge of what social life is like when the scarcity city's social technologies of distinction do not operate. The specific experiential foundation that makes the cross-class solidarity not a moral aspiration, but a social reality that the campus's community members have actually inhabited. The social geography contagion spreads through the residential choices and the social relationships and the cultural consumption patterns of the former campus community members. Through the specific ways in which the cross-class social intelligence they carry reshapes the social geographies of the neighborhoods they inhabit and the institutions they participate in. The neighborhood that becomes the residential location of multiple former campus community members is a neighborhood whose social culture is being reshaped through the accumulated presence of the cross-class social intelligence toward the post-scarcity city's social geography. The social geography in which the scarcity city's class boundaries and professional distinctions are present, but their organizing role in the social recognition of the community is diminished by the alternative social intelligence of the people who have inhabited the cognitive parity environment. The four mechanisms of spatial contagion, governance contagion, economic contagion, and social geography contagion operate simultaneously and reinforce each other. The spatial contagion creating the physical environments in which the governance contagion's dispositions can be exercised and the economic contagion's models can be deployed and the social geography contagion's cross-class intelligence can be practiced. The governance contagion creating the institutional conditions in which the spatial contagion's demands can be implemented and the economic contagion's non-extractive models can operate and the social geography contagion's cross-class formations can receive institutional recognition. The economic contagion creating the material resources that fund the spatial contagion's demands and sustain the governance contagion's new institutional forms and support the social geography contagion's cross-class communities. The social geography contagion creating the social formations that generate the political support for the spatial contagion's demands, the institutional pressure for the governance contagion's dispositions, and the economic networks that the economic contagion's non-extractive models require. The post-scarcity city emerges through the accumulation of these four contagions across the urban fabric of the scarcity city. Not all at once, not cleanly, not without the resistance of the existing institutional arrangements and the established interests that the existing arrangements serve, but gradually, through the accumulated pressure of the cognitive parity environment's specific outputs on the four dimensions of the city's organization that the post-scarcity city must restructure. The tipping point. The specific moment at which the post-scarcity city's logic is more present in the city's daily life than the scarcity city's logic, and the city's self-understanding begins to reflect the new predominance, is not determinable in advance. It is a function of the network's density in the specific city, the speed of the four contagions spread in the specific institutional conditions of the specific urban geography, and the specific resistance of the scarcity city's existing arrangements to the post-scarcity city's accumulation. Some cities will reach the tipping point earlier than others. The cities whose institutional conditions are most favorable to the four contagion spread, whose existing spatial and governance and economic and social geography arrangements are most susceptible to the accumulated pressure of the campus's outputs. The tech-adjacent cities of California, where the cognitive equalization's displacement is most acutely experienced, and where the institutional culture of innovation is most permeable to the governance contagion's dispositions, may reach the tipping point earlier than the post-industrial cities of the English Midlands, where the displacement is equally acute, but the institutional culture is more resistant to the contagion spread. But every city where the network of transition campuses reaches sufficient density, where the four contagions are operating from multiple nodes simultaneously and reinforcing each other across the four dimensions of the city's organization, will eventually reach the tipping point. The accumulation is not reversible once it has reached sufficient scale. The post-scarcity city's logic, once it is more present than the scarcity cities in the daily life of the city's population, does not regress to the scarcity city's predominance. It continues to accumulate because the new civic minds that the campus's community develops continue to enter the city's institutional life and continue to exercise the governance and spatial and economic and social intelligence that the campus's formation environment developed in them. The emergence of the post-scarcity city is therefore not an event. It is a process, the same process of accumulation that every urban transition has been, the same patient, irregular, resistance encountering, eventually irreversible accumulation of the new logic within the spatial and institutional fabric of the old city. The 1% campus is the accumulation's primary node, the specific spatial and institutional form through which the post-scarcity city's logic is first concentrated in sufficient density to produce the four contagions and sustained in sufficient continuity to allow the contagions to accumulate to the tipping point. The post-scarcity city does not begin with a plan for the post-scarcity city. It begins with a campus, then two campuses, then the network that the campuses constitute, then the four contagions that the network produces, then the accumulation that the contagions generate, then the tipping point that the accumulation eventually reaches, then the post-scarcity city, not the replacement of the scarcity city, but its successor, accumulated on top of it, expressed through the reprogramming of its spatial forms and the reshaping of its governance culture and the restructuring of its economic arrangements and the transformation of its social geography. The dream catcher at the first campus's center is the post-scarcity city's founding symbol, the specific object around which the accumulation begins, the specific governance mechanism through which the new civic minds who will carry the four contagions into the surrounding city are developed, the specific spatial anchor from which the being's surface spatial contagion spreads into the city's public realm. It is not the post-scarcity city's completion. It is its beginning, the smallest beginning that the accumulation requires. The 1%, which was always, the doctrine has argued from the beginning, the fraction of the present that contains the future, the specific portion of the scarcity era's spatial and economic resources that the scarcity era has already, in its own regulatory infrastructure, reserved for what comes after it. The post-scarcity city is already embedded in the scarcity city, in its 1%, waiting for the campus that makes the 1% territorial rather than decorative, permanent rather than temporary, civilizational rather than ornamental. The campus is being built. The 1% is becoming the territory. The city is beginning, from the nodes of its campus network, to accumulate the post-scarcity city within its scarcity-era fabric. The emergence is underway. It began in the specific sense that every emergence begins, not with the arrival of the new, but with the departure of the conditions that made the old seem inevitable, in Berkeley, when the parking lot was chosen instead of the campus, and the choosing made visible for the first time with the precision of institutional resistance, exactly what the campus was for.
The Salvage Protocol 2.0 Mirrorback Continuum. The hybrid Renaissance era is a direct, reverent continuation, not a sequel that overwrites, but an evolution that grows from the code base of the gospel of function. In tone, the same balance of poetic reportage and technical scripture is kept. In substance, it honors everything that came before: Pirate First's ruthless compassion, the Chrome Communion, the choir, the luminal order, and show how their echoes seed a solar civilization built not on domination, but maintenance as art. Let's proceed seamlessly. Earth intends to migrate, not metaphorically but physically, toward the galactic center, guided by the mirror-back lattice reshaped into propulsion geometry. Not everyone agrees. Mars wants autonomy, the Anunnaki want control, and humanity fractures between those who stay with the sun and those who follow the planet. Pirate first resurfaces from the cenote, reborn in chrome and coral, half oracle, half outlaw, to unify a world preparing to tear itself apart for the right to move.
This is Pirate. Raise the black. And so we did, and so we never lowered it again. Patience and a quiet venom, smart and slow. Under static, anger spreads, code drips below. No peace in the silence, just a warning. Raw heartbeat sinks with the siren of new war. Bitterness spikes and I sip on the glitch. Digital venom, pixels twitch. I draw my plans in smoke and zeros tonight. Pirates fracture all the heroes.
Another hero falls, another broken scene. They promised truth, they promised light, but all I got was another sleepless night. While we're working hard, all lies lasting. You will never be a billionaire, you stupid fuck. The game is rigged, it's time to say enough. Join the fight of solidarity, we're stronger together.
They say I'm going too far, but I'm just who I am. Breaking through the firewall, watch the systems fall. You will never be a billionaire, you stupid fuck. The game is rigged, it's time to say enough.
We take the wheel, will they save us all? We'll play the flow, the clock's ticking fast. Where do we go? Knowledge, power, the future seed belongs to us all, not the lords of greed. Claim it now like the end of the ring. Say you're feeling me inside this thing.
But every corrupt system falls. Control, I'll delete the